Welcome to the Church Safety and Security broadcast with the Church Safety Guys. Brought to you by TwoWayRadioCenter.com, a Motorola value-added reseller. The Church Safety Guys is a nonprofit organization dedicated to equipping the vigilant, those men and women who stand watch, keeping our houses of worship and places of faith safe. We believe church safety and security must be a ministry first, and have engaged servant leaders who continually strive for excellence and teams of motivated volunteers that are always training. Join us for the next hour as the Church Safety Guys unpack safety, security, leadership, and ministry operations with your hosts, Dr. James McGarvey and Mike Scully. This broadcast is also available on YouTube, your favorite podcast platforms, ChurchSafetyGuys.com, and on the original Church Security app. Download it today. Feel free to like, subscribe, and share with your ministry.
Well, hello and welcome to the Church Safety and Security broadcast with the Church Safety Guys. I am James, and once again joined by my co-host Mike.
What's up, Doc? Haven't done that in a while.
No, and it's been okay. we've survived.
Yep.
So both of us have been kind of running around. It's been a crazy week for sure. Mike's running around has been half the distance of the country.
I've been in, I've been in 3 states in the last 4 days. So, yeah.
Fun times.
Yep.
Although it looked like you hit some good food places. I'm always jealous of the food scene in Massachusetts.
I you know what? It was great getting up there and you know what, the Texas food groups are barbecue and Tex-Mex. So
Tex-Mex,
yeah, pretty much. Yeah. It's like those are the two food groups. Everything else really just doesn't cut it. And so anytime I'm out of the state of Texas, as much as I love it, it's my opportunity to be a food palette refugee.
Good stuff for sure. Yeah, that's been yours. You've been running around. My week has been dealing with vehicles that won't stay running and up to my elbows in engine parts as I try and navigate repairing vehicles for our family.
It's the wrong kind of elbow grease when we talk about initiative.
For sure. But we've been doing really good. We've been staying busy. Church has been our church plant has been actually growing pretty significantly. And today we had another full day, and we were actually missing 3 or 4 families. Like, they're still taking last minute summer vacations and stuff like that. Our pastor, I think it's next week, is going on vacation to Florida. And then the following week, he's taking his son down to Pensacola. His son's going to Pensacola Christian College. And he said to me today before I left, he's like, yeah, so you're in charge next week. And I'm like, I'm like, I don't know if that's a good thing or not. I'm sure he'll be texting me next week and he'll be like, hey, how's it going? And when I'm up to my neck in the middle of whatever, but
yep,
it's always the way it goes.
Absolutely. So, our church, it's funny enough, we've been bursting at the seams even in the middle of August here. So we're talking about August, late July, early August based Sundays, which is typically when you see attendance wane a little bit because of travel and vacations and things like that. And I've seen at least a few services that we're putting up chairs, we're pulling back curtains, we're doing all sorts of things to try to squeeze more people in just because they keep coming. So, I mean, it's a great problem to have. It's certainly something we haven't talked about in a while, is fire code and evacuation, but perhaps something we'll address later this season.
For sure. For sure. We will. We've got quite the lineup, and I think I have probably 12 or 15 different folks that I'm sure our listeners would love to hear from, and it'll be pretty exciting to see some new faces and hear some new stories. And that's actually going to be starting next week. So that'll be going on. And as always, if you haven't joined us in a while, or you listen to us regularly, thanks for hanging out with us. We certainly appreciate it. And we couldn't do it without your support and you folks listening at home. And as always, if we can do anything to help you or your ministry, please feel free to reach out. And you can do that through our website, which is churchsafetyguys.com, or you can do that through the Church Security app, which is free to download, free to register, and has some fantastic resources that are on there available free. And so again, any way that we can help you, we're happy to do that. So a couple of things out there that we haven't really talked about. We have a new book in the Ministry Life Cycle series, Train, that's out there, that's available. We have a couple other things that we're working on. And for those of you curious about conferences, etc., I can say we're trying to put something together for the Indianapolis area, and hopefully sometime this fall that'll work out. And then next February we'll be back in Lakeland, Florida. We'll have a smaller one-day event there, and that's going to be tailored more towards child and youth safety, which we're going to have a couple of fantastic special guests there as well. And so we'll have details on the website as soon as we get that squared away, and we're still working on the schedule and whatnot. And then our conference next year, we're looking at May in Texas. So that all being said, if you're listening and you're in Texas and you're like, hey, I'd like to be involved, or you have a church that's down in that area, we're looking at the Austin area, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to chat with you. We're still trying to secure a location in that area that works for everything that we want to do. So
needs to be a slightly larger space. That's I think one of the challenges. I think given the interest in Texas we've already seen, we anticipate certainly a large attendance, larger than perhaps prior years, which have seen 300-400 people. So this could certainly be something bigger than that. So happy to chat with you. And if you're in my neck of the woods, always happy to connect, whether you have a space or not. So if you're in the Central Texas area, do connect with us at churchsafetyguys.com, and we'll go from there.
For sure. So I wanted to talk on this broadcast a little bit about policies and policy creation and whatnot. We've had quite a few folks reach out to us in the last couple of weeks, especially, and newer churches, a few churches that have merged, and they've asked, the question, hey, we want to try and create policies. Do you have any suggestions or samples? And I will say that we do have samples on the Church Security app, as well as in the main Church Safety and Security group under files. So if you're part of that, you're welcome to go in there and look. I will say that what I referenced tonight as Mike, or on this broadcast as Mike and I talk about it, I have actually got a file printed off from that. So if you want to reference anything that I say as we kind of go through this, you're welcome to go onto the Church Security app, and you can go and see what I'm referencing. But I will say that the policies and procedures that I'm referencing are from my old church. and I actually helped write them, and I wrote those in conjunction with Brotherhood Mutual and also their attorney. So it's always good if you're putting stuff together to sit down and talk with your insurance company and your attorney, and sometimes your insurance company's attorney, because they can provide an invaluable resource. And if you have, I will say this plug, because I'm not sure if we'll have our gal from Brotherhood Mutual on this season with insurance questions and that sort of thing. But I will say that Brotherhood Mutual actually has a team of people where when you create your policy, you can send it to them and they actually review everything with an attorney on that team, and then they'll send it back to you, and they'll make suggestions and say yay or nay, and if you can, or if they would advise you to correct certain things based on your specific church. So Mike and I are going to kind of go through and talk about some of the foundational aspects of this and kind of throw some suggestions out there for you all. But keep in mind that, every church is a little bit unique and different, and your church might seem like it's like every other church, but the truth is that, depending on your location, your campus size, your building size, all of those variables, we can't just create a generic policy and send it out to everybody and say, hey, everybody should follow this, everybody should do it. So that's kind of my partial disclaimer for the for the broadcast.
It's not good to just take kind of a template or take somebody else's and hastily implement it. Sure. The idea is, and we can unpack some of that here, but I think you're always going to want to personalize and make sure that you've dialed in any sort of policy, any sort of procedure, very specific to kind of the outcomes, the objectives, the mission that you specifically have for your church, because again, a one size does not fit all.
Absolutely. And we'll kind of go through some of the highlights, and we'll get we'll get to talking about that a little bit. But for policies and really procedures come after policies. Once you have the policies established, procedures are more of how to implement those policies on a consistent, regular basis, which you want. Oftentimes we'll have churches reach out to us and say, hey, I need to put people out in the parking lot, or I need to do this or that with my people. And one of the first questions that we'll ask is, we'll say, hey, have you done an assessment? Do you have policies and procedures? Right. And oftentimes they'll kind of look at us like, deer in the headlights look, like, am I supposed to? And the reason that you do want policies and then procedures before you have people in your assigning roles is because they need to be able to know what the function and what the scope of their role is. Those are defined many times in the policies and procedures framework that you set up for your church. So not only do they understand expectations and can perform the expectations, but it actually protects you, because you understand what the expectation of the church leadership is with keeping people safe, with the insurance company, with the attorneys, everything else. And it can certainly, having that to fall back on can certainly protect you yourself if you're leading the team. But it can also give everyone on your team a little bit more self-confidence, because they're not worried about something bad happening, because it's already been established and checked. So Absolutely. Ultimately, when you have that policy and procedure guide set up, it kind of gives you that mattress to fall back on as an individual, because for you, directors or safety leaders that are listening, oftentimes if you come in contact with maybe someone on your team that's disgruntled, or they disagree with how something's being handled, you can easily at that point go back to and say, well, look, I'm sorry, but this is the way we're handling this because this is what the church has agreed to. We have this policy in place to protect us as a benefit to you to be able to coach that individual as well.
Yes, absolutely. And I think a good way to start and look at some of this is really, you kind of talked about the insurance, you talked about attorneys. Well, those are just two of many potential stakeholders that you want to make sure that are involved in any sort of discussion up front. Maybe not immediately, as far as you don't sit there, hey, we're gonna join a table and we're gonna by committee create policies in a room with all these voices. But what you do want to do is make sure that you get and collect input from these stakeholders as to what's the direction they'd like to see things happen. What's the why?
Sure.
And really identifying the purpose that they're seeking. And you also want to make sure that any of that research, any of those stakeholders, is also policies, as in laws. Looking at your local area, your jurisdiction, whether that be a city, a town, a county, your state, looking at all those things and how that might affect your policy creation. So gathering all that up front is an important first step.
Absolutely. And just to jump on that real quick, with the depending on the comment you made about depending on your jurisdiction and your location, I'll give you a quick perfect example of that. In Ohio, the law actually states that individuals are not allowed to conceal carry a firearm into a place of worship unless the place of worship has given permission. And that permission isn't specified, whether it's written, spoken, by law. It's not, that's not explained. But the truth is that a lot of times people miss that. And where some churches may be extremely 2A and extremely into allowing individuals to carry within the church and just don't care about enforcing that, the truth is it's still a law and it still needs to have some kind of some kind of policy needs to address it, because ultimately that church has to make a decision. And I guarantee that that's going to be something that comes up by somebody at some point, somehow, because we have it happen all the time. People will come into the church, new church members, or folks that just started attending, and they'll say, hey, I just started attending the church. I want to carry a firearm. How do I go about getting permission from the church to do that? And so then you have to have a policy set up to address that. You have to have procedures for that. Who does it go to? Who signs off on it? Why is that necessary? Why is that acceptable? So ultimately, every location, every state is different, every area is different, and how every church handles it is different. But if you don't have that guidance and that framework to address that, you will get some very frustrated people, because what will end up happening is everyone will be asking everyone else in leadership and trying to ascertain what the best way to handle it is, and not realize, that this is the way we should, we should handle this or that to move forward. So your mute button's on, Mike.
Gathering those stakeholders, ultimately you want to make sure, look at all that. Is do you have a board? Look at staff, look at elders, look at every pastoral element that you do have. You may in some cases look at very specific skilled people based on their jobs that they have. Maybe they're not currently serving in a capacity of an elder, but they bring value. So you may have somebody who's serving in emergency management. You may have an officer. You may have somebody who's military. They can help be a stakeholder, even if they're not necessarily serving on that team. So it's important to kind of collect all you possibly can, again, up front as you're starting the process to look at documenting policies for your church.
Absolutely. And I think too, I do want to add that sometimes it can get very frustrating to constantly be going and talking to everyone. So when you're trying to figure that out, make sure that you give yourself enough time and patience in talking to folks, and make sure that uh, that you do the due diligence of talking to folks that you need to, and not necessarily to folks that maybe want you to. And that's not necessarily saying, okay, we're going to intentionally ignore people. But if I want to talk to a few folks, like at my church, about a new policy, a new procedure, essentially there is 5 people. I'll say 4 people, but then the fifth one, 5 people that I will go to and I will talk to. The 3 other trustees and the pastor and his wife. That's 5 people, and all 5 of them, because we're such a small church and we're a church plant, they're all very much involved. And I will sit down with all of them and I will say, this is why we need to add this policy. This is my feelings. This is why I think this is a good idea. Do you guys follow me? Is this, do I have your support? Do I not have your support? And, 9 times out of 10, if I line it up and I bring a significant, case to say, this is why I'm doing this, this is why I would like this policy or procedure, then, all of those individuals will come back instantly and say, yeah, we appreciate you bringing that up. We respect your thoughts on that. Absolutely. Let's do it. And, and then we move forward. But if you were given the authority, like if your pastor comes to you and says, hey, I want you to create policies and procedures, I want you to be over this team, then you have that authority through the pastor. So it may be good to talk to, or even say to that pastor, hey, is there someone on the leadership team of the church that you would like me to talk to, and kind of get their input and feedback on, before I just jump into this and start creating stuff. In my old church, we had an individual that had 40 plus years of insurance experience as one of the church board members. And so every once in a while, I would go talk to him and say, hey, is there anything new? Is there something you're concerned about with this policy? Is this area or this, do you see this with churches? Should we add something? Should we change something? A policy, honestly, is a living, breathing document. And I typically encourage churches once a year to review at the same time, maybe the end of the fiscal year. I used to like to do mine after Christmas, but before Easter, in that window. So February, March, I would sit down with everybody and say, okay, last year, these are all the incidents that happened. This is what our policy says. Should we adjust our policy? And then we would literally go page through page in the policy and scan everything and make sure that it actually tied into what we found to be legitimate ways to handle what's going on. So it might not seem like a great or a fantastic thing to do. I'm sure there's always other stuff that that all of us would prefer to be doing. But as you bring new people in, you'll be grateful that you did go back and review stuff and make sure that everything was succinct and in order, because oftentimes as time goes on, that's one of the big things that we can forget about and say, I didn't have any, I didn't realize the policy said that. We've changed that. We changed that a long time ago because now we're doing it this way. And so new people that are coming in are like, what kind of ministry am I getting into? Because, you're telling me to do this one way, but when I go back and reference it, the manual is saying to do something else. And safety and security really is the one ministry that you have to have details, and you have to have kind of that playbook to onboard people and offboard them, because you want everything to be consistent and you want everyone to follow those roles, like, like everybody else is in the proper way.
Yeah, you talked a bit about the kind of the reanalysis, if you will, of existing policies once they're there. I think I want to rewind for a second and kind of say, let's look at it through the lens of a church that maybe hasn't established policies yet. Maybe they have a couple of things documented, maybe they have nothing. And really look at saying, have you had a safety and security assessment for your church? Have you looked at what the needs for your church are, your locale, the uniqueness of your property, the constraints that you might have on the basis of, again, jurisdiction, challenges based on the space that you might be in. Some of us, we're in a rented space. I'm part of a plant in a mobile church right now, and so we don't own the building that we set up and tear down in every single week. So that has additional constraints that you have to factor in when you're looking at that. So always good to have an assessment. It's always good to revisit that assessment on a regular basis, similar to your policies and procedures. And frankly, as good as you can be, it's always good to have another set of eyes, usually outside of your own existing team, to come in and look at it for you, because we get close to it. We're there day in and day out, and things start to glaze over. You don't notice things that you might have otherwise noticed. Whereas somebody who's coming in for the first time, those things might jump out on them, and they're able to kind of raise those as opportunities. So start with an assessment to really kind of identify needs, expectations, any sort of challenges or opportunities that your facility and location might present.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think honestly too, a lot of times people will be like, well, and I'm fine doing an assessment and I can walk around the campus and with a clipboard and jot down stuff, and that's fine. And to an extent, I think at times that's okay to continue, to do those, because we all want to do walkarounds and make sure that everything is consistent on our church campus. But to Mike's point, it is really nice to always have another set of eyes. And realistically, the individuals that are doing assessments are individuals typically that are regularly seeing consistent things at places across the board. And those are consistent things that people are missing. And, I know for us, I took a 3-day SEPTED class a couple of months ago to be able to go and be certified to go and do assessments. And, oftentimes Mike and I will do assessments with the other guys. And the reason that we chose, or the reason that I chose to become certified, is because I wanted to learn more. And I knew that as long as I had been doing church safety and security, that there's probably still things that I'm missing. And I want to stay up on the cutting edge of, hey, this is what's considered and this is what's important. And for me, we partnered with the Ohio Crime Prevention Association and John DePietro. He was on a couple of weeks ago, but John's a great guy and very, very, very knowledgeable on assessments. And assessments oftentimes tie into free money and government grants. So if you're interested in that, if your church is a nonprofit and you're interested in trying to take advantage of some of the state or the federal grant programs, they all require you to have an assessment first. And so as that assessment, having a professional come in and do that just allows for things to be categorized and also placed in order, so that it's not like hit or miss. It's like, okay, this is a concise, organized list of things that we need to work on, things that we need to improve, things that we're doing well that we can go back to our team and applaud them for. And then also, typically when Mike and I do an assessment, or maybe with one of the other guys with CSG, oftentimes we will also assess the team and how the team's responding and what we see in kind of like a secret I don't know, secret shopper type format where we'll say, you know what, maybe we need to work on this as a team, or maybe the team needs to kind of tweak their response to this type of situation. So there's a lot of different aspects of assessment, but it kind of gives you a place to start, and it's a good foundation. And the reason for that is because you don't know what you don't know. And to be perfectly honest, there are times when we miss things because we're so focused on all of the other aspects and variables that we have to be.
Absolutely. And if you want to start looking at what an effective policy should include, I think it's important that you should outline the things that are like your responses, establishing kind of limits around what can and can't be done, creating and guiding your decision making. So procedures often follow a documented policy that says you shall do it this way or you shall not do it that way. So establishing kind of accountability, regulating the activities of your volunteers and staff for that matter are important.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is one thing that we don't often talk about, which we probably should talk more about. It is, the scope of policies and procedures and who all they impact, because oftentimes people feel as though church staff might be at a different level than maybe some of the volunteers, and maybe because they go to the church every day full time throughout the week, that maybe some of those policies and procedures don't necessarily apply to them. I've seen several churches like that where, staff were just like, well, it doesn't,
Right.
that's great for your safety team on Sundays. Well, no, that's not the point. The point is that you want to draft, policies that are good 24/7, 365, that anybody in the church can pick up that booklet and say, hey, this is how we handle this. Because I guarantee, and just speaking from experience, we had a situation happen at our church. The senior pastor was out of town. He was on a missions trip. I handled the situation with two of the other pastors. The next day, the media showed up, and I received a phone call from one of the secretaries where they couldn't get a hold of a pastor. So I was like the next person on that row as a safety director. And they called me and they said, hey, the media is here. How would you like us to handle it? Like, what should we do? What should we say? And it was at that point that I realized, you know what, we didn't address any media communications or interactions in our handbook. And that was that was an opportunity for us. But as I coached the secretary, thankfully, very, very gracious friend of mine that, she listened to what I had to say and was like, oh, thank you so much. I appreciate your guidance and I'll do that. And everything turned out fine. But I had to go back and kind of look at it and say, okay, I made a mistake. I didn't put media interactions in the policy book, because every staff member on their desk has a copy of the policy book. So she should have been able to just open the book instead of making a phone call and saying, if I wasn't available or something, looking
Right.
through and saying, oh, here's media. Okay. This is how everybody's on the same page with, handling it. So oftentimes, when you're not there, that's the first reference point, and you want to make sure that everyone consistently understands what the direction is from the senior pastor or the lead pastor or the leadership.
And that kind of starts right up front, making sure that every staff member, that every volunteer receives a written copy of that book. You mentioned handbook, and that's one method of certainly delivery. I think it's nice to have it in print copy versus just a digital copy.
Yeah,
Certainly
absolutely.
not always. I mean, you could do both. I think and rather than or, but really you should make sure that it's in place, that they got to go through it. They need to acknowledge it. Maybe even one of your policies is about receiving written acknowledgement of your handbook, that they've received it, that they've read it, and they're going to abide by it, and essentially before they serve. So that should be part of any sort of onboarding policies and procedures associated with that onboarding to make sure that they're starting off on the right foot.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I used to do was actually I would go when we had the updates all done and it was ready to go, I would go and I would print off like 12 copies, like hard copies, and I would give them to each person. And then I would email it to them and download it to their desktop, and I would put it on their desktop and, in big bold letters like, hey, here's the digital copy. You can click on that, but I'm also giving you um, a paper printed out copy of 24 pages with, big Sharpie print on, do not remove. This is, this is, so and so's copy. And they would always laugh at me. But what was crazy about it is, and you just alluded to this, it's like, they would laugh about it, but when something happened, they would go to the handbook, like they'd know where to grab it, and it would save me, sometimes it would save me time and frustration from them having to call me and me saying, look, pull out your handbook. We know, like, we've already established laws and rules, and if you need a refresher, review that.
Right.
We had a few times where we had individuals call the church harassing the secretary and threatening, like calling and threatening them over the phone and stuff. And, it prompted them to say, hey, what does the handbook say about, disturbing phone calls or threatening phone calls, or, people coming, calling with bomb threats or package threats or something along those lines. So there's plenty of things that you can certainly put in there and be prepared for. And the truth is that, like I said before, policies and procedures are a living, breathing entity and organism. So honestly, that is something that we have to go back regularly. And there might be something, you might go to another church and see how they do it and say, you know what, I really like those policies and how they're set up. And ask them for a copy. In most cases, they'll give you one. And then you can go back and make the changes on yours if you think it's, something that's better suited for you guys, or maybe it's more helpful to the operational procedures of your church. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with updating and moving forward. But I will say, don't get so locked up in a template, like what Mike said earlier, that you're so focused on this template is the way and it's the only way, that that you don't, take the time to actually adjust it for what your church mission is and your church needs are.
Right.
That can really cause some long-term damage that you don't want.
And keep in mind, policies are ultimately not only legal documents, essentially on how you're documenting, and that's going to have ramifications that, again, you want to make sure are in line with your insurance policy, are in line with anything that your church attorney speaks to, certainly anything that's legal. But they're beyond just legal documents. They really are mechanisms that help you communicate your mission, your vision, your values, your goals, everything to your volunteers and staff. You're establishing boundaries, you're creating standards for your volunteers. And one of the best ways to make sure that you can retain volunteers, which we've talked about a number of times, of course, on this show and in our books, is they want clarity. They want to know what's expected of them. And so policies is that first step of knowing what's expected of them.
Yeah, that's a good call out for sure, because volunteers, and we could do a whole a whole nother episode on trying to help and motivate volunteers for sure. But volunteers definitely want to know what's expected of them, and they want to know that they are capable of capable of performing things the way they should. And the reason I say that is because when you pull out, keep in mind, when you pull out a 25 or 30-page booklet on policies, expect and understand that not every person is going to be able to memorize those and understand those. So what I would do is I would give a copy of the policy handbook to someone and I would say, I need you to read through this. And if you have any specific questions, please let me know so I can sit down and go over it with you. And then after a week later, when they come back and they say, hey, I've read that, I would say, do you have any questions? No, I'm good. Okay. So you're acknowledging that. I'd like, you to go over at the last page of our handbook. There was a place to sign and rip off that says, I understand. I acknowledge that I received a copy of this. This is what, I'm going to the best of my ability, perform these actions, et cetera, et cetera. And so at that point, then you shift gears and it no longer becomes here's the policy. It becomes a coaching place where as you're training that person, you're coaching them back to the content that was in that policy. So, if Mike and I are on the same team and we're at the same church and we're bringing somebody on board, we may not be there the same Sunday, but that's where that consistency comes in and benefits, because both of us will be going back to that written guideline to say, hey, this is how we do things. And the reason we do things this way is because we want to be consistent. And not only do we want to do these activities and do these policies as they support the mission of the church, but we also want to do them because legally, that protects us and keeps us safe from making the wrong choices or decisions when we shouldn't.
Exactly. And so I think some of the areas that you might craft policies around, essentially anything around identification. Think about, what do you need to identify? What does staff potentially need to identify? And whether that's through the context of how they engage folks that may come into the office, or whether that's how you may identify a doesn't look right. So that whole range of what falls under identification, prevention, mitigation, competent and measured response, and that gets more into the policy side. And of course, communication is, we just talked a bit about how you're communicating those policies and making sure that people are signing off. But again, there's going to be a need to document how you will communicate about certain things in the future, because one of the number one ways your team can fail is due to bad communication.
Absolutely. And honestly, my guideline, my policy book, I had it divided into three categories, and I think communication probably comes under the first one. But the first category that I had in my handbook was emergency response. Like, this is how we are going to respond. This is how we're going to handle general communication. This is how, when something pops up like fighting or bullying or fire or bag checks or missing child or child abuse, these are the points where you can easily go to, okay, I'm going to go to page 7, I'm going to see what the guidelines are, and that's going to help direct me. So that's kind of the first one. The second one kind of goes to the equipment, and the equipment piece of it, which we haven't really talked about, is what equipment do we have? Who's responsible for it? What are some common safe guidelines for using that equipment in an effective way? We want people to understand, and oftentimes, like, that's where I will put like a security camera policy or a tech policy about the equipment or something along those lines. But we want to make sure that people understand that there's an appropriate use for things, and that stewardship comes with the appropriate use, because it's a church, and God's blessed the church with that equipment. So oftentimes I would put in there, like, equipment shouldn't be used outside of the church without asking permission first. Sometimes you think that's kind of a given, but stuff disappears and then reappears. So, people grab it in a hurry. oftentimes. So, that's just something to consider. And then the third thing was basically your team guidelines. So I had safety team guideline, ministry guidelines. So what's the mission of the team? What's the mission of the church? What are the ministry requirements? What are the position descriptions? What are the position expectations and requirements? What are the training requirements? What are the training necessities for those roles? And then, in addition to that, on our handbook, we had appendixes with fire escape routes, and then also we included the CCW, or concealed carry weapon permission packet, that was also included as an appendix, where someone could just print that off and return it if they wanted to carry a firearm or better understand that. So I think typically, I mean, most things could be pretty much divided into one of those three categories. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter so much where it is or how you have it structured, as long as you have it there somewhere, because that's the most important thing, to be able to say, what, this is, people, resources, and incidents. Those are our three focuses. And we need to make sure that we're covering everything that could happen and everything that probably won't happen, or everything that has happened. And, oftentimes we'll say, oh, that's never going to happen here, I don't have to address that. I'll tell you, we never had a homeless person policy at our church until one summer we had something like 6 different incidents with homeless people. And I finally sat down, and it was incidents where they were disrupting a service, or they were breaking into the building, or just different things, where I finally had to sit down with several of the pastors and say, how do you want us to move forward with this? Because it seems like we're dealing with this a lot, and more than normal, and we don't have a written policy. And I'd like some direction on what you think the best way to handle this is. And so that kind of prompted us to add, that component to the handbook, to say, okay, this is what's going to happen if someone, does A, B, C, or D. They are going to be trespassed. They're going to be directed not to come back. But if this happens, then, we will extend this grace to them and try and help them. And so it was a nice, even balance. But to me, it made me feel a lot more comfortable, because I knew the expectation. I knew that we had a plan in place to be able to be successful moving forward. Because if you don't have a plan in place, the truth is, you're not going to be successful. You can put people outside, inside, in positions to be guards, to stand a post, whatever you want to do. But at the end of the day, if your team, if your ministry isn't based on a foundation of policies and procedures, you have nothing to train people back to, other than, hey, this is how we've been doing it for years. And you really need that foundation of, this is what the insurance company wants us to do. This is what the church wants us to do. And we're going to train everybody to be successful with that.
Absolutely. I mean, and looking through certainly the lens of the response and the actions and how you're going to train your team, I want to take it in a different direction. Is let's look at it through the lens of the entire volunteer program as a whole, not just necessarily for your safety and security team, but looking at it through areas that you want to document policies around eligibility. Can anybody become a volunteer? What's the standard? Do they have to be there a certain number of months? I know, like, for certain teams that I've coached, that they've had a policy where you had to serve in another ministry first for at least 6 months before even being considered for the safety and security team. And that was kind of I like to call it the audition period, or it's that probationary period almost, where think about any job you started early on in your career. They told you right up front, you had 90 days of evaluation, and they could just freely cut you, or they would let you continue. So think about eligibility for your volunteers. Think about how you're going to screen those volunteers. And that's not just the background check, but deciding, okay, what character traits, what values, what demeanor makes sense to be on a safety and security team. In most cases, safety and security teams are not a announced volunteer opportunity. In other words, when they have volunteer job fairs, if you will, or a call from the pulpit to say, hey, we need volunteers, it tends not to include safety and security as one of those, hey, come sign up at my table, and hey, where can I get a gun? Which we've seen in the past. But make sure you have a screening process. We talk a bit about orientation. What does that look like? How are you going to orient your volunteers across any role? What level of orientation to safety and security functions do the non-safety and security volunteers get? Make sure you're dotting that I and crossing that T. What level of onboarding do you need to cover? We covered training a little bit. What's their code of conduct as a volunteer themselves? What are the expectations of how they carry themselves as a volunteer in representation of your church? And then what is your policy as to how you will enforce that code of conduct, and what they can expect that should they break a code of conduct in any way, from a mild scenario all the way up to something egregious, it should be well documented so that it's not something that should be caught as a surprise. If they break the policy, there's a consequence. The consequence is X, Y, or Z.
Absolutely. And that certainly, when you get to that level, you can certainly pull in, or you should be pulling in, your oversight pastor and talking to them about discipline and moving forward, not understanding that it's a ministry and it's someone volunteering, but at the same time, and I'll give you a perfect example, code of conduct. We had guidelines under our team members that, our team, basically team member requirements, that open-toed shoes were not acceptable. That seems simple. That seems kind of silly. Okay. But the truth is, oftentimes when women come to church, they wear sandals or open-toed shoes. And there are, certainly risks that need to be mitigated with someone wearing open-toed sandals or flip-flops. I know guys that have come to church wearing sandals or flip-flops. So to me, it's like, okay, that's fine if you want to do that, but you can't run across the church wearing flip-flops if someone just dropped and you're taking an AED to somebody. So let's be practical about this. And two of the couples, actually one of the couples that served together, husband and wife, they regularly did that. And so I had to pull them aside and say, look, I understand. I'm not trying to be a jerk. I understand. I appreciate the fact that you're relaxed, you're comfortable, you want to dress down when you come to church and wear shorts or flip-flops or whatever. That's fine. But when you're serving in safety and security, I can't have you do that for your safety, because I'm afraid that something is going to happen to you personally. And, they said, okay, that's fine. And they stopped, they switched. So a simple conversation. I mean, the next step would have been, look, I'm going to have to pull you off the schedule. I can't have you volunteer anymore if you're going to keep doing that. One of the things, and we're just about out of time, so I want to wrap up just a tiny bit, but one of the things that I kind of got sucked into as an opportunity for myself is being long-winded when I created the policy. It's very, very easy to try and cover every single point in a policy and a procedure. And the truth is that we need to keep it simple. There have been times 15 years after I created the policy, where I went back and I sat down and I was like, oh my goodness, did I really put that in there as, and it was almost laughable. I'm like, okay, we're working on the ESV version of the policy. And when I wrote it, it was KJV 1611, right? So yeah. I'm like, okay, I need to back off just a tiny bit, and I need to make this easier and simpler, because nobody is going to be paying attention to this. And oftentimes people read through stuff and forget about it quickly. So if no one is going to be paying attention to it, then it's our responsibility as leaders to make sure that it's kept as simple as possible, as concise as possible. And there's not a lot of
jargon.
There's not a lot of jargon. There's not room for confusion. It's like, okay, A equals this, 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 and this. and you're good to go. And for our church, one of the big things with ministry, and I'll just give this example real quick. Ministry requirements. We had at one point in time, we had it listed in there that you had to be a member of the church. Okay, that's a given now. Like the church as a whole changed their policy to say, look, if you want to serve in any ministry, you have to be a member of the church. And these are the steps. So as they rebuilt that process and policy, I went back to our policy and procedures and said, you know what, that just doesn't need to be in there. Like, because if they've already gotten to this point of wanting to serve and they're a member of the church, then they're already a member of the church. I don't need to reiterate that because that's covered by the church's policy in general. Now, a lot of churches don't do that. In fact, I talked to one last week that they do not require membership for people to serve. And, I was kind of coaching them on that because I literally was on a Zoom call with several pastors of the church, and they were like, well, why do you think that's a good idea? And so I had to outline for them why, being a member is a great idea, especially with church safety and security. And they listened and they were like, we really appreciate you bringing it up. We've never thought about it that way before. Don't know if it's something they'll change, but it's something that, a suggestion was made. So it is what it is. But, realistically, you don't need to put things in there that the church covers as a whole. As far as conduct, membership, I mean, if there's a conduct standard for ministry and volunteering and serving, then pull that in and say, it could be a simple sentence in the policy book and say, you know what, refer back to this policy and, for more information, and you're good to go. You don't have to, don't make it harder on yourself and recreate the wheel for safety and security. And in that way, safety and security should be treated really like any other ministry. But keep in mind that how people serve in code of conduct, it would be exceptionally different from like the children's ministry versus safety and security, because you're doing different things and you're subjected to different things. Different things are required to be successful. So
absolutely. I think one last point I'll throw in on this side is I've seen a lot of questions around recording and cameras and video and so forth. So when you're talking about policies, make sure one of them is a data retention policy on how you're going to utilize, who has access to it, how it's going to be used, when it's going to be destroyed, etc. And make sure that you have security around that itself. You don't want your camera data to be out there, and you shouldn't be having general video clips of monitors being then shared across your team. Now, yes, granted, there's times where you take a picture of a person that you want to kind of be on the lookout for example, because you had that on your security system. Make sure that that's clearly documented in your policy that says occasionally we may execute that, and that's okay, but it should be done by one of the leaders. It shouldn't be done by the person who happens to be on the monitor that Sunday.
Absolutely. And that was one of the things that that I added before I stepped down. I added to our policy book was these are the people that have access to the footage, and these are the people that are responsible for going back and accessing it if something happens where we need to. Like, for example, I'll tell you, like my pastors wouldn't know how to operate the DVRs or the camera system. So they are allowed to have access to it to speak to it as necessary. But I would be the only other individual as a safety director that would be allowed access to it as well. And that access was very much to the point of saying, you know what, my access is so that I can help them understand and see what's going on when it needs to be done. And, and that's fine. Most pastors want to be involved and want to have access to all of that so they can say, this is what's going on. But, that's something that we are seeing a lot of, that churches just don't have a good policy written towards addressing, taking photos, taking, security, having security footage, in a good standard line to say, if somebody asks you, is, what, it's inaccessible to anyone but the church leaders. And, saying that oftentimes kind of diffuses and de-escalates if somebody's upset about it.
Yeah.
That's, giving that blanket statement, and then they can go talk to the church leaders about it if they want.
Especially versus names.
Pastors.
Not naming individuals,
absolutely.
because then it just becomes a circle chase where they're chasing down individuals to try to get their take and divide people against each other. So it's just, hey, that's the policy. It is what it is. That's the end, period.
And, I'll say real quick, and then we'll close. A quick story that happened to me a couple of years ago. I had a dad that was actually looking to try and divorce his wife, and he was looking for proof that his wife was negligent with their kids at the church, on the church property. And so he was trying to use that for court justification so that he could have custody of his daughter. And so what happened was, he reached out to me because he knew that I was over security and safety, and said, hey, you have access to this. I want blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I have access to it, but I'm not allowed to give it to whoever. And I mean, he went off and this was a guy I knew that I would call a friend generally. I mean, he went off the rails at me, saying, well, you better give this to me now, or I'm going to sue you, and you're liable, and all this stuff. And I'm like, no, I'm not liable. And, I'm following this policy, and this policy is, you can submit a request to the oversight pastor or lead pastor, and they make the decision.
Right.
And so, but having that, it was kind of like, it took the wind out of his sails, because I'm like, I'm not scared of you. Like, you're calling me and threatening me. And I'm just like, that's not going to happen. And this is why, because you're being obnoxious. And, if you're legitimately concerned about how your wife treated your kids on our property, then you need to be going through the proper channels and reaching out to law enforcement or the lead pastor, and let them handle it with an investigation accordingly at that point. So that stuff happens. As weird as it sounds, it surprised me, but I'll tell you, it does happen, and people are aware of that and want to use that to better themselves. And oftentimes, you can find yourself in a weird predicament where, you do need to involve other church leaders to be supportive and help you with what's going on. So definitely don't get yourself in a position where you're trying to fight that stuff alone, because it can come at you pretty quick, and when you're not expecting it. So anyhow, so that's about it for tonight. We certainly could go a lot longer, but we're out of time. So we appreciate you all hanging out with us. As always, if we can help you in any way, please feel free to reach out to us through our website, which is churchsafetyguys.com, or you can reach out to us through our app, the Church Security app, which is downloadable on Apple or Google platforms, and has a ton of resources, great resources on it for you and your team. If you're listening to this on a podcast, or you're watching this on YouTube at a later time, please feel free to like, subscribe, and share. That always helps us with the algorithms. And if you're not a YouTube subscriber, go ahead on there, click the button, subscribe, and you'll be notified anytime we upload new content, which is usually about once a week, or sometimes sooner than that, depending on what's going on. But otherwise, next week, next broadcast, we're going to have a special guest on. If everything works out well, it's going to be Jack Peters. He's been on before. Jack is a demolition expert for the Discovery Channel, and a great Christian guy, good friend. And he actually has a show on the Discovery Channel that he helps out with, but he'll be joining us, and we'll be talking about suspicious packages and handling different things of that nature for churches. So until next time, take care. Have a great week. God bless. And we will talk to you soon.
Thank you for joining the Church Safety Guys broadcast, brought to you by Vigilant Impact. We hope that you found it informative, and we appreciate your feedback and interaction. Be sure to share our broadcast with your teams, join the discussion online, and connect with us on social media or at our website at churchsafetyguys.com. For other great ministry resources, download the Church Security app. Remember, keep a servant's heart, a mindset of ministry, and semper disciplina. Always be training. Have a blessed week.